moved into my new apartment with a heavy heart. After a tough breakup, I needed a fresh start. My name is Emily, and I'm 28 years old. I found a place in a quiet neighborhood, hoping for some peace. The apartment complex is mid-sized, neither too big nor too small. It's an old building, but well-maintained with a certain charm to it. I liked that. My apartment is on the 3rd floor, and it has a nice view of the small courtyard below. When I first walked in, I felt a mix of excitement and sadness. Excited to start a new chapter, but sad because of everything I had been through. The apartment was empty and echoed as I moved my boxes inside. The walls had a faint smell of fresh paint. The floors were wooden, a bit creaky but sturdy. I could see the courtyard from my living room window. It had a few benches, some flower beds, and a small fountain. The sound of the water trickling was soothing. It made me feel like maybe this place could be home, as I struggled to move my heavy boxes. I felt a bit overwhelmed. Just then I heard a voice from behind me. "Need some help?" I turned around to see an older man standing in the hallway. He looked to be in his late 60s with a kind smile and gentle eyes. "I'm Mr. Johnson, your next-door neighbor," he said. I was surprised but grateful. "Oh yes, that would be wonderful," I replied. Mr. Johnson helped me carry my boxes inside. He was surprisingly strong for his age, lifting the heavy boxes with ease. As we worked, he told me a bit about the building and the neighborhood. He seemed so kind and helpful. I felt lucky to have such a friendly neighbor. By the time we finished, I was exhausted, but I thanked Mr. Johnson for his help. He smiled and said, "If you need anything, just let me know. I'm right next door." I nodded, appreciating his generosity. After he left, I started unpacking my things, trying to make the apartment feel like home. A few days after moving in, I started to notice something strange. Whenever I left my apartment, Mr. Johnson was always there, watching me from his window. It seemed like he always knew when I was coming or going. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. He would wave and offer a friendly smile, sometimes even coming out to chat for a minute. Then, Mr. Johnson started finding excuses to visit my apartment. One day he knocked on my door asking to borrow some sugar. Another time he came by saying there was a maintenance issue he needed to check. "Just a quick look, Emily. You know how these old buildings are," he said, stepping inside before I could protest. It didn't stop there. He began leaving small gifts at my door. Homemade cookies wrapped in a cloth napkin, flowers from his garden arranged in a jar. At first it was sweet, but then it became too much. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or rude, but his kindness started to feel suffocating. One night, I came home late from work, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. As I walked down the hallway to my apartment, I saw Mr. Johnson waiting by my door. My heart skipped a beat. "I was worried about you, Emily," he said with a concerned look. "You're usually home by now." His concern felt invasive. I forced a smile. "Just a late night at work, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for worrying, but I'm fine." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. I quickly unlocked my door and went inside, closing it firmly behind me. The feeling of unease was growing stronger. Why was he always around? Why did he care so much about my schedule? Then things took an even stranger turn. My belongings started to go missing. At first it was small things, a hairbrush, a scarf, a book. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being forgetful. Maybe I had misplaced them in the chaos of moving. But the coincidences were too many to ignore. One evening, I tore my apartment apart looking for my favorite scarf. It was nowhere to be found. I sat down on my bed, feeling a creeping sense of dread. Something was very wrong. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down I knew there was more to it. The friendly neighbor who had seemed so kind was now a source of constant unease. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. I felt trapped in my own home, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next unsettling encounter with Mr. Johnson. One evening, as I was settling down to watch TV, I heard strange noises coming from Mr. Johnson's apartment. It sounded like muffled voices and thumping, sounds I was not used to hearing coming from his or anyone's apartment. Curiosity and concern got the better of me. I slipped on my shoes and quietly made my way down to the courtyard. I stood beneath his window, straining to hear. The noises were clearer now, definitely voices, but I couldn't make out any words. My hands were trembling as I tiptoed to the window and peeked inside. What I saw completely freaked me out. There on the wall were pictures of me, dozens of them, taken without my knowledge. At the grocery store, walking to my car, even through my apartment window. Scattered among the photos were my missing personal belongings, my hairbrush, my scarf, and the book I thought I had misplaced. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. This was beyond creepy. It was terrifying. I ran back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. What was I going to do? I couldn't just let this go. I had to confront him, but I needed to be safe. I grabbed my phone, quietly walked back over to his apartment, and recorded the wall with all those pictures of me on it. My hands were shaking as I recorded and made sure to keep myself from view. The next day I gathered the courage to knock on his door. He opened it with a smile, but his eyes seemed different now, darker. I asked him why he had my pictures and belongings. His smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion. He denied everything, but I stood my ground, knowing what I had seen and that I had proof. His face twisted with anger. He claimed he was protecting me, keeping me safe from the world. But his words only heightened my fear. He took a step forward, his tone becoming more threatening, insisting I needed him. He tried to force me into his apartment. I used all my strength to push him back and managed to slam the door, giving me some time to run away. My hands were trembling as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I spoke to the operator, my voice shaking, I saw Mr. Johnson coming after me, shouting about how I didn't understand his love and protection. The noise was deafening, and I could barely hear the operator over his yells. I begged for the police to hurry, feeling him closing in on me. Just as Mr. Johnson reached me and grabbed me firmly by the arms, my phone dropped to the ground and Mr. Johnson kicked it out of reach. He started pushing me in the direction of his apartment, and as I began shouting, he covered my mouth with his hand and dragged me more forcefully. Just then, a guy popped his head over the railing on the floor above and saw what was happening. "Hey, let her go!" he shouted. And then we heard him running down the stairs. Mr. Johnson let go of me, glaring at the guy who was now coming straight at us. Mr. Johnson ran inside his apartment, locking the door from the inside. The guy waited with me until the police arrived. After the police arrested Mr. Johnson, I couldn't bear to stay in my apartment. I called my friend Sarah, and she immediately offered her home as a safe place for me to stay while I figured things out. Her apartment felt like a haven. It was warm and inviting, and she made sure I had everything I needed. The police visited me there, thanked me for the recording I provided, and shared that the security cameras at the apartment building also clearly captured Mr. Johnson's threatening behavior. They assured me that he would be facing serious charges. During this time, I started looking for a new place to live. I couldn't return to the old apartment. It held too many bad memories, and I just couldn't get myself to feel safe. I finally found a new apartment in a more secure building. It had a doorman and keycard access. I made sure to get to know my new neighbors from a distance. I kept my doors locked and my windows secure. I also signed up for a self-defense class, wanting to feel more empowered and capable of protecting myself. These were all new habits born out of the terrifying encounter with Mr. Johnson. As I reflected on the ordeal, I realized that while it's important to be kind and open, it's also crucial to be mindful of the people I let into my life. I became more vigilant, more aware of my surroundings, and more protective of my personal space. With time, the fear faded, but the lessons stayed with me. I moved forward, stronger and wiser, determined never to let my guard down again. My new home felt safe, and I knew that I would be okay. I had survived, and I would continue to thrive, one cautious step at a time. I was driving home after a long week on the road. Being a traveling salesman means lots of time behind the wheel, and I was exhausted. My name is Tom, and I'm in my late 30s. That particular evening, I was on a desolate, rural highway. The sun was setting on the empty landscape of vast fields stretching out, with only the occasional farmhouse or abandoned building breaking the monotony. The road seemed to go on forever, with no other cars in sight. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. The radio was playing softly, but the signal was weak, and the static was almost louder than the music. I kept glancing at the clock, eager to get home. The thought of a hot meal in my own bed kept me going. As I rounded a bend, I saw something up ahead. A car was pulled over on the side of the road, its hood up, and a man was standing next to it waving for help. My first instinct was to drive past. It was getting dark, and you never know what kind of trouble you might run into. But then I thought about how I would feel if I were in his shoes, stranded on a deserted highway with no help in sight. I slowed down and pulled over. The man approached my car with a look of relief on his face. He looked to be in his early 40s, with short, dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He was dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt. He looked like an ordinary guy. Feeling sympathetic, I unlocked the passenger door and he climbed in, placing a small backpack at his feet. At first, our conversation was light. Daniel thanked me repeatedly for stopping, saying how he had tried to call for help, but couldn't get a signal. I nodded, understanding how frustrating that could be. We talked about the usual things: work, the weather, how empty the highway was. Daniel seemed knowledgeable about a lot of things. He told me he was a mechanic, which explained why he had been trying to fix his car himself. He talked about different places he had traveled to, sharing interesting stories. He seemed friendly and polite, and I felt my initial wariness fading away. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, the sky turned a deep blue, and the first stars began to appear. The road was now illuminated only by my headlights, creating a tunnel of light through the darkness. Daniel's voice was calm and steady, and I found myself relaxing a bit. It felt good to have some company on this lonely road. But then, Daniel's stories began to take a strange turn as they became increasingly bizarre. He spoke of places he had visited where things had gone terribly wrong. He mentioned violent incidents, fights he had been in, and accidents that seemed too frequent to be mere coincidence. My unease began to grow. The way Daniel described these events, with a certain cold detachment, was unsettling. I tried to convince myself that maybe he was just eccentric. Perhaps someone who had seen too much in his lifetime. But I was definitely starting to feel uncomfortable. He started revealing personal details about my life. He mentioned places I had been recently and things I had done. The accuracy of his statements was alarming. He talked about the motel I had stayed at the previous night and the diner where I had lunch earlier that day. My confusion turned to unease. How did he know so much about me? I began to suspect that Daniel had been following me for days. The idea of being watched and tracked was terrifying. I glanced at him, trying to keep my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. I had to be careful, had to figure out what was going on without letting him know I was onto him. Daniel's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more intense and focused. He started talking about how easy it was to track someone and learn their habits. He spoke about how predictable people could be, how routine made them vulnerable. I realized this wasn't just idle chatter. Daniel was hinting at something much darker. I tried to keep my cool, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. Every word Daniel spoke seemed to confirm my worst fears. He had been stalking me, learning about my life, my routines, and now he was in my car. I noticed that Daniel kept glancing at my bag, which lay on the seat between us. Inside were my wallet and important documents. His eyes lingered a bit too long, and I could see a calculating look in them. My paranoia spiked. What were his intentions? Was he planning to rob me? Worse. I needed to think fast. I had to find a way out of this situation without alarming him. The road stretched out endlessly before us, and I felt trapped, alone with a man who might very well mean me harm. Then, up ahead, I saw a sign for a rest stop. It was deserted, just a small, dimly lit area with a restroom and a couple of vending machines. I told Daniel I needed to use the bathroom, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, seemingly indifferent, but I took my car keys with me, not wanting to leave them in the ignition. Inside the restroom, I tried to come up with a plan. I needed to get back to my car without Daniel noticing. I couldn't just walk out the front door. He would be waiting, watching. I had to think of something else. I noticed a small window at the back of the restroom. It was just big enough for me to squeeze through. I climbed up and pushed the window open. I slipped out, trying to make as little noise as possible. I landed softly on the ground and crept around the building, keeping to the shadows. As I approached the car, I could see Daniel through the window. He was rifling through my bag, confirming all my suspicions. My fear turned to a cold, hard determination. I had to get out of here. Quietly, I crept closer to the car, praying he wouldn't hear me. I managed to reach the driver's side door and carefully opened it. I slid into the seat and started the engine, but the noise gave me away. Daniel's head snapped up, and he rushed toward the car. My hands were shaking as I tried to put the car in gear. Daniel grabbed the door handle and tried to pull me out. A struggle ensued, his hands clawing at me as I fought back with all my strength. I managed to overpower him, pushing him away from the car. I slammed the door shut and hit the gas pedal, speeding off. I looked in the rearview mirror. Daniel was standing in the middle of the road, watching me with a menacing glare. The sight gave me goosebumps. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I drove to the nearest town, feeling a mix of fear and relief. As soon as I reached a safe place, I called the police and explained what had happened. But the response I received was not what I expected. They did not take me seriously. They insisted, somewhat jokingly, that I was my own hero and no longer in danger, right? The officer's dismissive, almost patronizing response made me question everything. Had I imagined the danger? Had I convinced myself of something that wasn't real? For the next 2 months, those doubts gnawed at me. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, wondering if I had been wrong. Maybe Daniel wasn't as dangerous as he seemed. Maybe I had let my fear get the best of me. The uncertainty made me feel like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. Then, one morning, I saw a news report that shook me to my core. A young man had been found dead on the side of the road, not far from where I had picked up Daniel. Police investigation led them to a hitchhiker who had been terrorizing and murdering people. This hitchhiker had a history of violent crimes and had killed 2 others previously. The description and the methods matched Daniel perfectly. The realization hit me like a freight train. I hadn't been imagining things. The danger had been real, and I had come terrifyingly close to being his next victim. The shock of how close I had come to death was overwhelming. I felt a strange mix of relief and comfort. Relief that I had escaped, and comfort in knowing I was not crazy. This experience taught me a powerful lesson. I had doubted myself, allowed others to make me question my instincts. But those instincts had been right all along. I realized that I needed to trust myself, to stand by what I knew to be true. Even when others doubted me, the memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder to trust my gut feelings. It reinforced the importance of being vigilant and aware of the risks around me. My experience that night would always remind me to stay vigilant, to trust my instincts, and to never doubt what I knew to be true. Late at night, when the campus was quiet and the halls of my dorm were empty, I often found myself heading to the 24-hour convenience store down the street. My name is Sophie, and I'm a 20-year-old college student. After long hours of studying, I craved a break, a snack, something to keep me going. The convenience store was my go-to spot, only a short walk from my dorm. The store had an eerie calm about it at night. The fluorescent lights, shelves lined with snacks and drinks, and musty smell to me represented a moment of freedom from the academic stress. Occasionally, a few other late-night customers would come and go, but for the most part it was just me and the night shift cashier, Mike. Mike was in his early 30s, with an unkempt appearance and a nervous demeanor. His hair was messy, and he often wore wrinkled clothes that looked like they had seen better days. Despite his disheveled look, he always seemed eager to chat. Every time I walked in, his eyes would light up and he'd give me a wide smile. "Hey there, need anything special tonight?" He'd often ask as I browsed the aisles. At first, I found his friendliness harmless. It was nice to have a brief conversation after hours of staring at textbooks. I'd respond politely, making small talk as I picked out my snacks. "Just the usual," I'd say, smiling back. Over time, Mike's comments started to change. What once felt like harmless small talk now became increasingly inappropriate and personal. He began asking about my classes, probing for details about my friends, and even inquiring about my dorm room. The questions were too intimate, too invasive. Each visit left me feeling more uncomfortable. I tried to convince myself that he was just socially awkward, but deep down, I started wondering how innocent it all really was. Then one day I noticed that Mike had started following me on social media. He liked and commented on almost every post. He mentioned things that only someone who had been thoroughly combing through my profiles would know. His familiarity with my daily routines and activities unnerved me. I began to feel watched, scrutinized in a way that was anything but casual. In an attempt to regain some sense of privacy, I started to limit my social media activity. I made my accounts private, stopped posting as much, and unfollowed people I didn't know well. But the feeling of being followed lingered. Then came the day when I began to see him everywhere. At first I thought it was just someone who looked like him always passing my dorm in the mornings as I left for class. But then I started seeing him every day at my favorite coffee shop, sitting at a table in the corner, watching. The final straw was seeing him on campus, strolling casually as if he belonged there. His presence felt inescapable. It was clear now. Mike was stalking me. I began changing my routines, avoiding the places I thought he might be. I took different routes to class, stopped going to my usual coffee shop, and even considered switching dorms. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the fear that he was always nearby, watching my every move. One night, after an especially unsettling interaction at the store, Mike had hinted at knowing my schedule, making an offhand comment about when he would see me next. It was too much. I left the store feeling extremely anxious. As I hurried back to my dorm, I constantly looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see Mike following me. The darkness felt oppressive, the quiet night broken only by the sound of my hurried footsteps. I fumbled with my keys at the dorm entrance, desperate to get inside. Once I was in, I bolted up the stairs to my room, locking the door behind me. Safe inside, I leaned against the door, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Mike's interest in me had crossed a line into something much more sinister. The small, dimly lit convenience store was no longer just a place to grab snacks. It had become the center of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I decided I would stop going to the convenience store. One night, after a session at the library, I saw Mike following me as I left. I picked up my pace, hoping to lose him in the small crowd of students milling about. Each step felt like a race against time. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him still there, his gaze fixed on me. Reaching my dorm building, I was relieved to see the entrance. But my relief quickly turned to panic when I noticed the security guard was absent. The lobby was empty. I quickly entered, the door closing behind me with a loud click, offering a false sense of security. As I headed up the stairs to my room, I tried to calm myself. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. I tried to remain calm, knowing that panic would only make things worse. I had to think quickly. I couldn't let him follow me to my room. I needed a plan, a way to escape. An idea struck me. There was a rarely used stairwell at the far end of the building. I decided to lead Mike there, hoping to trap him. I acted as if I was heading to my room, but at the last moment, I changed direction, making my way to the old, seldom used stairwell. I entered the stairwell, the door creaking loudly as it closed behind me. The air was cold and stale, the lighting dim and flickering. I hid in a small alcove, holding my breath. As I waited, I heard Mike's footsteps approach. He opened the door and stepped inside, his presence filling the narrow space. I watched as he passed by, unaware of my hiding spot. Gathering all my courage, I quietly slipped behind him and blocked the exit, trapping him inside. With Mike trapped, I ran to the nearest phone. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial the number. I called campus security, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. They took my call seriously and promised to send someone immediately. Security arrived quickly. They apprehended Mike, ensuring that he couldn't harm me. I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in weeks. Mike was questioned, and although he was not arrested, the authorities granted me a restraining order. The college took additional measures to ensure my safety. They increased security around the dorms and installed more surveillance cameras. Mike also lost his job at the convenience store, and although it took me a couple of months, I did eventually return to the same comforting late-night routine. The memory of that night served as a powerful lesson. I shared my story with friends, warning them to be careful, to trust their instincts. I wanted others to learn from my experience, to understand the importance of being aware and prepared. To those listening, remember this. Always be aware of your surroundings. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't brush aside those feelings. They could save your life. The ordeal with Mike was a terrifying chapter in my life, but it didn't define me. I moved forward, stronger and wiser, determined to live my life on my terms. The shadows of that night were a reminder, but they no longer controlled me. I had taken back my power, and I would not give anyone the chance to invade my privacy again. It was one of those especially dark, moonless nights. I was driving home after spending the evening with a friend. The road was surrounded by dense woods, and the only sound was the steady hum of my car's engine. The drive had been uneventful so far, and I found myself lost in thought, replaying the night's conversations in my mind. But then, without warning, my car began to jerk. The engine made a strange noise, and before I knew it, my car rolled to a stop. I tried to restart it, but the engine only coughed and died again. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I got out of the car and opened the hood, hoping it was something simple I could fix. But as I stared at the engine, I realized I had no idea what I was looking for. Worst of all, my phone's battery died earlier that night, and I had no way of contacting anyone. The dark woods around me felt even more oppressive now, and the rustling of leaves grew louder as I tried to think of what to do. Just as I was beginning to panic, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. A car was coming. I waved my arms, signaling for help. The car slowed down and pulled over next to mine. A man got out, shining a flashlight in my direction. He looked to be in his 40s, with a rugged appearance and a friendly smile. His presence was a beacon of hope in the dark night. The man introduced himself as Carl. He seemed genuinely concerned about my situation. He offered to take a look at my car, but after a few minutes of poking around under the hood, he concluded that it was beyond a quick fix. Carl suggested he give me a ride to the nearest town, where I could find help and maybe get a tow truck. Grateful and with no other options, I accepted his offer. As I locked my car and climbed into his truck, the inside of his truck was warm and smelled faintly of gasoline. The dashboard was cluttered with maps and tools, and the radio played softly in the background. The ride to town should have been a short one, but as we drove, Carl began to take turns that I didn't recognize. The road became narrower and more isolated. My sense of unease grew with each passing mile. I glanced over at Carl, trying to gauge his expression, but his face was unreadable in the dim light of the truck's interior. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, and the silence inside the truck became almost suffocating. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Why was Carl taking this route? Where were we really going? As we drove deeper into the woods, the road turned from asphalt to gravel and then to dirt. The trees seemed to close in even tighter, their branches clawing at the sides of the truck. My heart started beating fast as I realized I was far from help. Alone with a stranger on a deserted road. We finally came to a stop in front of an old, abandoned gas station. The building was dark and dilapidated, with broken windows and rusted pumps. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Carl turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. I felt a cold chill as I realized that my night was about to take a terrifying turn. I glanced at Carl, and his friendly smile was gone. In its place was a look of cold determination. My gut told me I was in danger, and I knew I had to act fast. Although I found it hard to think straight, I knew my survival depended on my next move. When Carl momentarily looked away, I quietly unlocked the door and bolted out into the night. I heard Carl shout behind me, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me. I pushed myself harder, sprinting toward the nearby woods. The trees offered cover, and I hoped the darkness would hide me. Carl's voice echoed through the trees as he searched for me. The terror of his approach made my hands shake, but I forced myself to keep moving. I needed to find a place to hide, somewhere he wouldn't think to look. Stumbling through the darkness, I came upon an old overgrown trail. The path was barely visible, but it was my best hope for finding safety. I followed it, the branches scratching at my arms and face as I pushed through. Every step felt like an eternity, but I couldn't stop. I heard Carl getting closer, his voice growing louder. I ducked behind a large tree, holding my breath. I pressed myself against the rough bark, willing myself to be silent. Carl's footsteps crunched on the leaves as he passed by, so close I could see the glint of his flashlight. He stopped for a moment, and I feared he had seen me. But after what felt like forever, he moved on, continuing his search. Desperate and exhausted, I knew I had to keep moving. The trail eventually led me to a road. I could hardly believe it when I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. I stumbled out of the woods, waving my arms to flag down the car. The driver, a concerned passerby, stopped and rolled down the window. I quickly explained what had happened, my voice shaking with fear and exhaustion. The driver let me into the car and took me to the nearest police station. At the police station, I gave my statement, detailing everything that had happened. The officers immediately launched a search for Carl. They suspected this might be the same guy that was recently reported for something similar that they have been looking for, and knew this meant they had a chance of catching him. Later, I learned that the police had captured Carl. He had a history of severe mental illness, and although I do not know more about whether he had in fact harmed anyone, it was definitely clear that he was a danger to society. After the police captured Carl, I stayed with a close friend for a few days. I couldn't be alone after everything that had happened. The fear was still fresh in my mind, and I kept looking over my shoulder. My friend helped me feel safer and pushed me to go and see someone to work through the trauma of that night. I am so glad I did. Though the experience took some time to recover from, I am grateful for the lessons learned in being more careful about my safety. I never travel alone, especially at night, without a fully charged phone anymore. And if a party goes on until the early hours of the morning, I either drive home with someone or ask to crash until daylight.